Welcome to our last session. This panel is going to be focused more on accessible victim support services, and we'll have two speakers online, Aleksandra Ivankovic from Victim Support Europe and Maja Štahan from Victim Support Croatia. I think they're online already. We're going to follow the order of the program. I'm going to ask Aleksandra to come in first. So sorry you couldn't make it, Aleksandra, on account of the snow in Brussels, but it's really nice to see you. We're really looking forward to hear from both of you. Hope to get more inspiration about what works, especially victim support for persons with disabilities. Whenever you're ready, Aleksandra. I'm not sure if you prefer to share PowerPoint or us to do it.
It's absolutely fine. I can share mine. So
okay.
Let me just then do that quickly. I think this is the one. Yes, it is. So first of all, I'm really, really sorry. Thank you, Bruno, for already explaining my situation. But I was on the way to come to Budapest today, and then there was that one snowy day in Brussels that happened yesterday, and everything collapsed in Belgium because they were taken by surprise despite the advances in weather forecasting and everything else. But I'm currently stuck at the airport in Warsaw waiting for the flight back to Brussels tonight. So
sorry to hear that.
I'm very disappointed in the circumstances. So sorry about the title, because title is actually not corresponding to my presentation. Title is going to talk about, in general, victims with disabilities and not just victims of hate crimes. So I have to say that Eliona kind of took some points and covered a lot of points that I wanted to cover, because I obviously supporting victims with disabilities is quite a lot related to their ability to involve with criminal justice systems and to actually successfully pursue criminal proceedings successfully, in the sense of getting into the criminal proceedings, overcoming the barrier, as Gianpiero quite rightly asked the question. I was happy I was very satisfied with Eliona's explanation about why we see the failure of prosecutors to pursue cases as a barrier for victims with disabilities. But I would say it kind of goes on to most victims, unfortunately, but for victims with disabilities in particular. So anyway, I will just briefly talk about the layout for victims' rights, victims' needs, and what Victim Support Europe as Victim Support Umbrella sees as important issues in terms of supporting victims with disabilities. I'm just going to make the angle a bit better so you don't see all the people crawling behind me. So the thing is that we talk about victimization of persons with disabilities, and I apologize if I'm kind of repeating some of the basic things that have been stated previously, because I couldn't be there all day. But 1 in 10 people in the EU has some type of disability. So we're talking about 10% of EU population who are persons with disabilities, which we then compare against the fact that EU estimates that around 15% of all EU nationals actually fall victims of serious crime every year. But then when we look into the picture of victimization, we understand that persons with disabilities are 2 to 7 times more likely to actually be victims of crimes in comparison to persons without disabilities, in comparison to the general EU population. And then when we compare that, and we will look into the situation of persons with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, then we know that they're much more likely, of all persons with disabilities, they're much more likely to be victims of crimes. And yet we have systems that are in place that are not able to recognize this victimization, that are not able to acknowledge victimization of persons with disabilities, that are not able to provide an environment for persons with disabilities in which they can safely participate in justice proceedings, where they can receive accessible services. And so this is where things become more complex, so where we understand that persons with disabilities have much more difficult time in experiencing victimization, and at the same time also having much more difficult time in accessing services and accessing criminal justice proceedings. So this is what the environment, this is the context within which we are trying to develop victim support systems and victim support frameworks. So when we talk about persons with disabilities, it's also important to know that there are some forms of victimization that are specific to persons with disabilities, not necessarily only, but are more likely to affect persons with disabilities. And those are forms of victimization particularly related to institutionalization and the types of crimes that are happening in an institutional enclosed environment where the person is in a relationship of dependency with their primary support provider, and oftentimes also like depend legally of the person who's their primary support provider. We're talking about sexual and reproductive health uh, victimization in terms of forced sterilization, forced abortions, etc., that are often have elements of crime, but are rarely seen as crimes and rarely pursued and prosecuted as crimes. We also see situations that are related to parental rights of persons with disabilities, whether they can be parents and how they can parent their children. And again, like understanding environments and situations in which these kinds of victimizations happen that may not necessarily even be seen as criminal, but can also still like have the effect of victimization for persons with disabilities. And then we also have hate crimes because persons with disabilities are one of the protected categories when it comes to the definition of hate crimes, but again, not in all legal systems. So I don't know, again, I haven't been here all day and yesterday, but I don't know if you talked about the fact that in some countries, actually disability is not recognized as protected category for hate crime. So most prominently in Sweden, when through the consultations with persons with disabilities, it was actually decided to not include hate crimes against persons with disabilities in the definition of hate crime. So that means that in Sweden, a person with disability cannot be victim of this particular crime. But we do see that persons with disabilities are much more likely to be subjects of hate, and this is why hate crimes have been included in this slide. So when we are talking about support for victims with disabilities, victims of crimes with disabilities, what Victim Support Europe is starting from is the Victims' Rights Directive as the main EU instrument that talks about rights of victims, needs of victims, and that is laying ground for the national victim support frameworks. The directive defines a set of rights for victims of crimes, which are based on needs of victims of crimes. And this is what Victim Support Europe has been looking into and trying to develop, is how do we translate the needs of victims and here I talk about all victims, how do we translate needs of victims into rights, claimable rights, and how can we support victims to actually enjoy their rights, to have their rights implemented throughout their victimization journey and throughout their recovery from victimization. And so based on that, I will just outline some of the rights that victims have in criminal proceedings, and these are the rights that come from the Victims' Rights Directive. And then going back to what has been said by previous speakers, so right to be heard. Every victim has the right to be heard. Every victim has the right to question decision not to prosecute, rights to safeguards in the context of restorative justice, right to legal aid, to reimbursement of expenses, to return of their personal property that might have been taken as evidence during criminal proceedings, right to decision on compensation, and then right to individual needs assessment. So there is a right of victim and obligation of member states to conduct individual needs assessment for every victim of crime who reported the crime to the authorities in order to ensure response to that victim in from 4 risks, and that's risk from re-victimization, repeated victimization, retaliation, intimidation, and most importantly, secondary victimization. And this is where we see the biggest risks actually for victims, because the authorities, the parts of the system in response to victimization, in their communication, in their contacts with victims, they are highly likely to cause secondary victimization, which we need to protect victims from. And the way to protect victims from secondary victimization is by identifying their needs and responding through their needs by providing them services. So I will now go to needs and talk about needs of victims, because the Victims' Rights Directive is built on the understanding of five needs, five main groups of needs of victim. The first one is respect and recognition. The first, in no particular order, but they're presented here in that order. Respect and recognition, protection, and as I said, protection first of physical safety, but also protection from secondary victimization, support, including provision of information, access to justice, and compensation and restoration. So these are the five main groups of needs of victims. And we need to build support systems that can respond to these, that can identify these needs, and that can then respond to those needs. And so each victim of crime has some type of these five needs. And then our task is to recognize them and to be able to respond to them. And then we have, when we understand the needs of all victims, then we need to understand that victims, certain groups of victims can have shared needs or shared groups of needs or subgroups of needs. And so it's not just for victims with disabilities, it's for, like, for example, children, it's for victims of gender-based violence, victims of terrorism, victims of hate crimes. So depending on different types of indicators, we can talk about groups of victims and how needs of these groups of victims are different than needs of other groups of victims. And for victims with disabilities, we see that one big part of responding to their needs is providing accessibility, is providing procedural accommodations, is providing legal recognition, especially for victims who are under guardianship. And I'll talk a little bit later about that. So that's like where we are building these systems to make needs, to make the services for victims with disabilities responding to their needs. And then last but not least, what we need to do is what I referred to previously. This is like this individual needs assessment, but not just in terms of protection, which is responsibility of criminal proceeding actors, but also in terms of individual support needs assessment. So what are the support needs? Does the victim need a psychologist, a lawyer, legal advisor, or like the personal officer? I can't remember the term from Iceland. It reminded me of personal ombudsman that they have in Sweden. But like, you know, the roles of different support services that can provide responses to the needs of victims. So when we understand that, and when we go back to the needs of victims with disabilities in relation to criminal proceedings, but in general, in relation to access to services, we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about procedural and reasonable accommodations, depending on whether it's criminal proceedings or whether it's when we're talking about services. So I will now talk a little bit about barriers for victims, and I will focus more on barriers for victims to access services rather than to access criminal proceedings. But in general, there is, you know, it's kind of, it comes from the same place. So the first part is, and this is what Eliona also mentioned, is identifying the victim. So how do we get victims with disabilities to be identified as victims? I remember I was talking a number of years ago with a police officer who was one of the people who was behind organizing a hate crimes unit in a European country. And he was talking about a case where he was investigating hate crime against a young man with intellectual disability who was insulted, bullied, and spat on by his peers in school. And then when the investigation was started, this young man thought that that was normal because he was exposed to these kinds of behaviors for a long period of time. And there came to the point where he just thought that this is how people are expected to communicate with him. And so he wasn't even able to identify this as wrong and as victimization. And so we start from normalization of violence, normalization of bullying, normalization of certain behaviors that are not acceptable in human relationships. And then like we need to overcome that as a first barrier to reaching out to victims with disabilities and to supporting them, because we need to overcome their own kind of inherent barrier to identify themselves as victims. Then we talk about also the system that is unable to recognize victim with disability as a victim because of, and some of some of these examples have been mentioned previously about, she's not able to verbalize her victimization. She's not able to give her statement. I'm not able to understand what she's saying is actually a better way to put it. And then this is how we have difficulties to basically understand who the victims are and identifying the victim. And this is starting from this basic need of recognition. So identifying and recognizing the victim to be able to respect them, to give them the status as a victim, so that we can move into the next stages of understanding their needs and responding to their needs. So I will just quickly mention some of the barriers in criminal proceedings, and they are particularly related to legal capacity. So if a victim has no legal capacity, then the question is whether they can actually choose themselves who will support them, whether they can undertake legal actions in proceedings, like whether they can assume the status of an injured party in some systems, whether they can file a compensation claim. How can they do it? Do they have a bank account? If they file a compensation claim, do they have a bank account where they can independently have access to potential compensation that they might get, etc. So these are the kinds of issues that we need to think about and overcome. Obviously, financial barriers, because services cost money. Obviously, victim support services are free of charge and they're provided free of charge, but then there are some services that are conditioned by certain census. They are conditioned by ability of the victim to pay in advance to be able to be reimbursed. For example, for psychological aid, that is quite often the case. For legal aid, that is quite often the case. So like whether the victim has actually resources themselves to advance these kinds of payments to be able to reimburse the cost later on. But then there is also the issue of statute of limitations, because many legal systems have the concept of statute of limitations where a crime cannot be prosecuted after a certain period of time. And then we have victims with disabilities who, as we talked about all these barriers previously, so even when they're able to identify their own victimization, even when we are able to say, okay, this was a victim, then it might already be too late to actually undertake any steps in criminal proceedings, which then brings us to step one. We're not able to kind of give the recognition to the victim, and we already failed them at their first step of responding to their needs. So then I think, and I mentioned that briefly, guardianship.
Sorry, Aleksandra, to interrupt. 2 minutes to wrap up.
Wait, okay. Okay. So I mentioned guardianship, so I will not stay on that longer. I believe that everyone here knows about guardianship. Accessibility, I think it's important now to talk about services, and this is where the kind of the bulk of the problem comes, is that in general, environments are not accessible for victims with disabilities, and I'm not telling you anything new. And this is also not unknown in terms of access to victim support services. So obviously there are barriers in physical access for victims to services. There is barriers to intellectual accessibility. So like, rarely things are provided in easy to read format and in easy to understand format. Pictograms are not being used. Assistive technologies are not being known to providers of victim support services. So obviously we have that problem. We have problems with sensory accessibility, and absence of universal design, talking about victim support services. So this is definitely something that Victim Support Europe is advocating for, is accessible services for victims with disabilities, either through the provision of services directly by victim support services that are available to all victims, so to make them accessible, or through collaborations, referrals, etc. So we know, for example, that some of our members provide accessible support through the use of sign language interpreters, for example, of working with DPOs to be able to understand how to provide services, and then working in tandems with supporters of persons with disabilities to understand how to put together a support plan and provide support to persons with disabilities. So these are the sort of things that are definitely important to take into consideration. And then what is also important is to understand that victim support is required before, during, and after the criminal proceedings, and unrelated to criminal proceedings. And so, but especially like we see that there is often this kind of dropout of support systems once criminal proceedings are over. And we understand that there's a particular need to develop care plans for victims with disabilities towards the end of proceedings, so that we can know how to support them after the proceedings, because proceedings are only a small part of their victimization experience. Making sure that victims have access to compensation, and especially when I talk about, and I mentioned that already, victims who might be under guardianship, making sure that they can actually themselves get access to compensation, not their guardians. And then making sure also that secondary victimization can continue after criminal proceedings. So making sure that we protect victims from secondary victimization during, outside, and after criminal proceedings. So I will stop there. I thank you very much. And I'm, again, very sorry that I'm not here with you, that I missed dinner tonight and everything, but I hope that we can have some time for discussion later on. Thanks, Bruno.
Thank you so much, Aleksandra, for the overview of, and especially for highlighting how important victim support services are for persons with disabilities. And it's a great segue for Maja's presentation, which that I understand working on a very innovative project to make support services more accessible for everyone. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Maja Štahan. I'm the coordinator for the National Call Center for Victims of Crime. We are part of Victim and Witness Support Service Croatia, one of the programs, and I will give you Croatian national overview of what specifically what we did to make our services as accessible as possible at this moment. And I'm very happy to be here today. So thank you, Bruno, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here to be able to share our experiences with you, because for us, it is very important to ensure equal access to our services, at least. Yeah, so that's it. Could you please share my presentation? I send it.
I think it's about to be shared. There you go.
Yes, thank you so much. We can go on the next slide. Yes, thank you. So first, I would like to very shortly present what we do. So I work at the National Call Center for Victims of Crime, that is Croatian 116006 helpline. For you who don't know, 116006 is a European standardized number, and those helplines are open in 13 European countries. So we provide legal and practical information to victims, witnesses, and their family members. We provide emotional support. We refer victims and witnesses to other NGOs and institutions, and we assist them in preparing the claims for financial compensation provided by the state. Yes, so our helpline is available 24/7. It is free and it is completely anonymous. For me, when I think about the victims, the one of the most important rights there is the right to be informed. So we have a special role in providing the information to victims and witnesses in Croatia, because we are usually the first contact point after they file the criminal report to the police or to the district attorney, and they usually call us immediately afterwards when they seek either emotional support or some kind of information about their rights, criminal or other procedures they're going through. And so we opened in 2013. So for the first 8 years, our main communication channel was our helpline, so 116-006 helpline. And the breaking point for us was 2020, the year of 2020, when COVID lockdown happened. There was a series of earthquakes in the central of Croatia. We were in a lockdown, and we started to notice that more and more people started using social media and chat options they provided, like direct messages on Instagram and Facebook Messenger for contacting us. Obviously, for different safety reasons, we weren't comfortable providing support on those channels or exchanging sensitive and private information, because we do talk about the private and sensitive information. So we noticed that there is the need for like additional mean of providing support. We were like discussing what we could do, and at that time we were very lucky, because at that moment we had financial stability. Well, we are still NGO, so there is never a financial stability, but we were at a good place at that moment. And we had 7 employees working in national call center. That was more than ever before. So we started discussing among us what could we do and how can we expand our services. So we decided chat should be our next like option that we provide to our customers, to victims and witnesses that call us. And we also started piloting opt-in referral system with in partnership with Ministry of Justice and Ministry of Police. Yes, because as I said earlier, we were always aware that our helpline is not accessible to everybody. But at that time, we just didn't have enough resources and staff, to be honest. Next slide, please. So yes, in the last 11 years that we've been operating our helpline, we received more than 19,000 calls. So 19,000 people called us in that period. When I talk statistically, 75% of those people were women. And 60% of them suffered domestic violence or other forms of gender-based violence. Because we are a national helpline, that kind of experience gave us the overview of challenges that victims and witnesses are facing. As I stated earlier, we are anonymous helpline. So the person that calls us, they decide what kind of information they will give to us. So I checked the statistics when I was doing the presentation. 5% of callers stated that they have some form of disability. But I believe well, I'm sure that that the percentage is even higher, but they just didn't feel open to share that information with us. So that gave us, as I said, a great overview of challenges that victim and witnesses, and especially persons with disabilities, are facing in Croatia. So I mentioned some of them. Aleksandra talked about how persons with disability are more vulnerable to various forms of violence, physical, sexual, emotional, financial abuse even. But what was very shocking for me that so we live in 2024, but we are still talking about physical barriers that victims are facing. We had one example. One of our callers told us that obviously the building, the police station, wasn't accessible for her. So she had to file a criminal report at the parking lot when it was raining. So I think that those kind of situations aren't acceptable in 2024. But beside physical barriers, communication barriers are also a very big issue because there isn't enough sign language interpreters in Croatia, and the victims often stated that they had difficulty understanding written materials that they were given. And even now, social stigma and discrimination is a big part, reason why they don't seek for help and why they don't contact the institutions. And also, Aleksandra talked about that also. People who are in the institution, persons with disabilities who are in institutions and are in the relationship of dependence, they also have difficulty to ask, to seek for support. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I also wanted to mention that when we talk about the challenges that I mentioned, this is for Croatia. So, but I believe that the same or more or less similar situation is in the other countries in EU and around the world. Well, yes, and all those findings and the situation I talked about later motivated us to prepare a project to apply a project chat for victims for grant. So when we finally made the decision that we are going to expand our services to chat, we were obviously researching available chat applications at the market. And what we found out that the existing options are not as accessible as they should be, or at least as we needed them to be, because some of the features we were looking for were video call options, a speech to text and text to speech option, specifically for Croatian language, audio messages, and the list goes on. So, and having all that in mind, we didn't find it, obviously. So that is the reason why we started this project. So the main aim of the project is to improve the support system for victims of crime who are persons with disabilities. Sorry, by implementing a live chat service that is accessible to them, with emphasis on persons with hearing, speech, and sight impairments, as well as intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. We have two main objectives. The first one is we wanted to lay the foundation for providing comprehensive online support via live chat service by conducting a research on how to make that chat service more accessible. And the second one is to provide equal access to justice and information for all victims of crime by developing a chat-based online support service tailored to the needs of persons with disabilities. By developing it and obviously implementing it. Next slide, please. We couldn't do this alone, so we have 5 wonderful partners on this project. Obviously, Victim Support Europe and Validity Foundation, but there are also the Official College of Psychology of Madrid from Spain, Center for Legal Resources from Romania, and Legal Center for the Protection of Human Rights and Environment. Next slide, please. The project, we started it in the summer of 2022. It is still very active. Victim Support Europe prepared some of documents that are, at the moment, that are very valuable for us because we are now in the final stage of developing the chat application. But I should mention that we developed a training manual for trainers and handbook providing distance support live chat service. That handbook was created based on the national and international desk research, interviews with experts and focus groups with people with disabilities in all 5 countries. And also it contains practical guidelines for providing support via chat. So it contains all the practical information you could need if you think about providing support via chat to persons with disabilities. As I said, we are now in the final stage of developing that chat. It will be ready by the end of the year. And in 2025, we will test it with our partners. But we didn't want to wait because it was very difficult for us to even start that phase because of the financial issues. You know that developing an application is it can be very, very expensive. But we finally managed to find a IT company that was that we could pay, to be honest. But in the meantime, we've been testing one of the commercial chat applications on our website because communication part is very tricky. So when you provide emotional support through chat, it can be very, very tricky. So it was important for us to gain some experience when we start providing support via chat, like for real. Next slide, please. And I want to finish, so this is my last slide. I was thinking what is needed for improving accessibility. I was thinking about Croatian situation territory. First, I would say that funding is the crucial part because we are an NGO and we provide our services for free and nationwide. But we didn't get any kind of funding from our government. So I would say that governments, especially our government, needs to ensure that adequate funding and resources for NGOs and institutions are provided. Obviously there are some gaps in the legal framework and they need to address that. Furthermore, Aleksandra also mentioned universal design. I think, especially in Croatia, we need to talk more about that. Because the idea of the universal design is that we need to design services that are accessible to all in its core without any need for additional adaptations and retrofitting. So, well, universal design. Funding, and well, last but not least, I think that we still have a lot of things to do when we talk about public awareness campaigns, at least in Croatia. I believe there could be, we need to create more campaigns to reduce stigma and raise awareness about the unique needs persons with disabilities are facing in the context of victimization. So thank you for your time. That would be all. And if you have any questions, I'm here. Feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Maja. It was very inspiring to hear about how victim support organizations can adjust or even change the kind of service provision they give, especially in response to COVID. Thank you so much. We still have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions, if any of the audience has any. I know I have, as usual, for absolutely everyone, but maybe I can ask one for Aleksandra, because I was very curious about the practice that you mentioned. I'm not sure if you can expand on it from Sweden. I think it was personal ombudsman that you mentioned, something that exists in Sweden. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's a service for persons with disabilities. So it's not necessarily victim support service. And from what I could understand from the Icelandic principle, I think it's relatively similar. So it's basically people who are available to be advocates for persons with disabilities who might have their own kind of problems with communicating with the authorities, etc. So they're like this bridge between the person with disabilities and the institutions, etc., in terms of being there and advocating for them whenever needed. And it's actually interesting. I mean, in Sweden, I think I mentioned it to you, but I think it's really interesting in terms of when we talk about, and just for me, it was really, I'm now like, I need to understand Icelandic practice, because it really sounds very, very, very interesting from the point of view of victims. So the issue with victims with disabilities is that for them to receive support, you need to have a multidisciplinary approach. So it's not just, like you get all that you need from one person. And this is what we also heard from the previous speakers. So like you need to have a lawyer, but you also need to have someone to support communication needs and someone to understand what are the needs of victims and then advocate for that in relevant institutions. So it's interesting to understand how you set up those teams and what are the dynamics between different teams, because it's necessary to kind of find the right way to communicate. So this kind of mediation service that personal ombudsman can provide in Sweden and that these advocates can provide in Iceland are really fundamental services, but cannot act alone because you always need other people. So I mean, it's that's basically what I wanted to say, and maybe I haven't said well enough in my initial presentation.
Thanks so much, Aleksandra. I understand there's one question from the audience online, I think from Tanya. I'm not sure if it can be read or not possible. Okay, and I think we need to start wrapping up as I understand it. Thank you so much, Aleksandra, Maja. Too bad you couldn't join us in person, but it's wonderful to see you once again. Keep in touch. Thank you so much.